Okay, we've got a few more presentations yet today, so we do want to get started right away here at 2 o'clock. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Fort White's virtual Earth Week presentation today on composting. We're so pleased that you've tuned in safely to celebrate our beautiful planet with us. My name is Dana, and I'm the Group Services Manager here at Fort White, and I will be moderating this presentation. Just to make sure that there's no technical glitches and so that the audio is great for everybody, we are asking that everybody stay muted and to use the chat function for any questions that you might have for the presenter. We will take time at the end of the presentation for questions, so just fire them in that chat. I'll be collecting them, and then I will ask them of Mina when we are ready. For anybody who's not muted, I will do so as we get ready to start here. I'd like to introduce you to Mina Goulet, our sustainability and French bilingual interpreter, who will be talking to us about compost. Everybody enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dana, and for monitoring the program today, or moderating, I should say. So as Dana mentioned, I am the sustainability coordinator here at Fort White. I've been on staff for 11 years now. And I've been in the sustainability coordinator role for, I think, about six or 7 years now. It goes back a while. So I really have a personal passion for waste reduction, and composting is something that I'm really interested in. So really excited to be sharing some information with you guys today on how to start composting, and hopefully you will take some of this information back home with you and start your own composting programs. So let's get started. We'll start with the very basics. What is composting? It is the process of collecting organic material, facilitating decomposition, and returning nutrients to the soil. So in other words, composting involves collecting kitchen scraps and yard waste, putting it in a pile so that it can break down, and returning the finished product to your garden or indoor houseplants. So decomposers like bacteria, fungi, worms, and insects break down plant matter into essential nutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and magnesium. Why compost? There's lots of reasons. First of all, maybe not the most important, but one that often catches people's attention is to save money. So if you're composting, you don't have to buy commercial fertilizer from the store. And soil with compost in it requires less watering. So you're going to be saving on your municipal water bill. Compost is an excellent fertilizer. The nutrients are slowly released, making them available to plants longer, whereas chemical fertilizers can run off into our water bodies and are in fact reducing water quality. Whereas composting is a pollution-free, nutrient-rich alternative that's completely natural. Compost adds microbial life and organic matter to the soil. So this helps to maintain soil quality and texture. And organic material also takes up a lot of space in our landfills. So we're extending the life of our landfills by keeping our organics out. We're going to do a quick little compost quiz here. So I would like for you to guess what percentage of the garbage that we make at home can be composted. So if your camera's on, you can raise your hand when you think you hear the right answer, or you can type your answer into the chat. Either one works. Okay, so option number 1 is 10%. Option number 2 is 20%. Number 3 is 40%. And number 4 is 75%. So I'm just pulling up the chat here. Whoa, lots of numbers coming in. 40, number 3, so 40%, 40%, 75%, 20%, 75, 40, 40, 40, 40, 75. Okay, so a bit of a mix, a bit of a range there, quite a few 40s and several 75s as well. Okay, so many of you had the right answer. Oh, it is, oh, come on. My next slide. There we go, 40%. That was a dramatic pause. 40% of the garbage that we produce at home can actually be composted. So saving organics, putting them in a bin can have a really big impact on how much waste we're producing. So where does our garbage go? For example, if you are not composting, you're throwing your kitchen scraps, your yard waste into the garbage, what happens to it? Well, it goes to the landfill or a specially designed site where we bury our garbage. So Winnipeg's garbage goes to Brady landfill in the southwest corner of the city. So why don't we want our organics in the landfill? There's several reasons. Buried organics can react with metals in the landfill to produce toxic leachate, which can pollute our groundwater. And it's actually a big misconception that when you put garbage in a landfill, it decomposes or breaks down. But landfills are actually designed so that garbage doesn't break down. When we put garbage in a landfill, we bury the garbage with other garbage so oxygen can't get to it. And in order for garbage to break down properly, especially food and yard waste, it needs air. When these things break down in a landfill anaerobically or without air, they create greenhouse gases. So composting can actually reduce the impacts of climate change. Historically, our planet has seen natural temperature fluctuations, but today the planet is warming because of our activity. So things like transportation, heating our homes, and manufacturing are all releasing additional greenhouse gases. So burying organics in landfills is contributing to these emissions. So you might have heard of carbon dioxide. That is probably the gas that's most commonly referred to. That's what comes out of our emissions from driving vehicles and those sorts of things. But landfills release something called methane, which is 21 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. However, by composting, we're also reducing CO2 emissions from vehicles that are being used to transport all our waste. So what we're doing at Fort White, I'm very proud of the work we're doing on waste reduction. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Fort White has partnered with Compost Winnipeg. It's a commercial composting company in the city. So they have a large scale compost pile and can accept more items than what you would put in a backyard compost bin. So they can accept things like meat, dairy, and compostable dishware, which works really well for us because we have a cafe on site. So we have collection bins located in all buildings on our site. And we also collect paper towels in our bathrooms. So since 2017, the Interpretive Center and Cafe have diverted 21,117 kilograms of organic waste, otherwise known as 45,000 pounds, 45,000 pounds. So that's the equivalent of 13 mid-sized cars. So that's pretty astounding. 45,000 pounds really blows my mind. So we do also do some traditional composting. We have a farm on site, Fort White Farms, and they have a compost pile. And the finished compost goes back into our gardens on site. Okay, so here's the really good stuff you guys have all been waiting for. How do you start composting? So the good news is it doesn't require a lot of fancy equipment or a high level of expertise, which means you can get the whole family involved. So there are 3 basic things that you need for composting: an outdoor space, a compost bin, and organics. Although having said that, you don't actually need a bin to compost. You can just keep a pile of materials in your yard, but bins do help to keep your compost contained. So we are going to talk a little bit about them. So there are several different types of bins available. It's not a bad idea to start small and expand your composting system as your needs change. So there's a few things to consider when you're choosing a bin type. Number one, the amount of organics that your household produces. So whether you're a family of 2 or a family of 6, you're certainly going to be producing more or less waste. Also, you want to consider, number 2, the available space that you have for composting. Third thing you want to consider is if you're interested in building your own bin or buying one from a store. And lastly, you also want to consider how much time you want to invest in your composting system. So the easiest option is to go with a store-bought bin. There are several styles available, many of which are molded plastic. There are also molded plastic bins that are rotating, so it makes it really easy to turn your compost. Bins with multiple compartments allow for varying stages of decomposition, which means you can leave some of your compost alone so it can break down fully. Then you can start a new pile with fresh materials in another compartment. Multi-bin systems also offer a place to store your brown materials, which we're going to talk about shortly. Generally speaking, a compost pile that is 3 feet tall by 3 feet square will generate enough heat during decomposition to sterilize the compost. And lastly, you're going to want to place your bin in a shady area that has good drainage. So the recipe, what do we actually put in our compost bin? So you're going to add organics by switching between layers of green and brown material. Brown material is much lighter than green, so you need about 3 times the amount. So for example, for every 1 pail of kitchen scraps, you should be adding 3 pails of brown material. Keep in mind, this is volume and not weight. Greens are materials that are rich in nitrogen. So nitrogen is very important for plant growth. Too little and plants won't grow properly, but too much nitrogen can also be harmful. So greens include things like your fruit and vegetable scraps, chopped corn cobs, crushed eggshells. They help to neutralize acidic materials and create a richer finished product. Coffee grounds, filters, and natural tea bags. You want to be careful because some of them nowadays are plastic. So make sure you have a natural bag. Fresh plant and grass clippings, garden trimmings and plants, bread, plain, pasta, and rice. If you are adding these grains, make sure that they don't have any oily or greasy sauces on them. The smaller the material, the faster it'll decompose. So if you are able to, if you have the time, it's a good idea to shred or chop your materials whenever possible. That was the greens. The browns are items that are rich in carbon. So browns include things like dry, brown, untreated grass clippings, dry leaves, wood chips and twigs, hay, straw, shredded paper, cardboard, and napkins. So there are also things that we don't want to add unless you have compost pickup with Compost Winnipeg, or you're a part of the city's compost pilot program. There are certain types of things you don't want to be adding in a backyard bin. So these include things like meat products and bones, dairy products, so things like cheese, yogurt, and butter, oily foods, so fried foods, any kind of spreads, prepared and processed foods, such as pizza, plants that have been treated with chemicals or have diseases, weeds, and obviously any type of garbage, so plastic foil or other things that might have been around your food. So we know what goes in the bin. How do we actually get this new compost pile started? So you're going to want to start with a fluffy layer of browns at the bottom, so about 6 to 8 inches deep, to absorb moisture from the pile and keep things well aerated. You can also use a bit of finished compost or add a bit of finished compost to the bottom of the pile to introduce microbes. This isn't necessary if you have the right conditions, but it will help to give your pile a bit of a head start. So add green materials in thin layers, not in piles, so that all the material has contact with browns. The layers don't have to be completely even, but the green should be covered with a thick layer of browns to prevent any smells and avoid attracting unwanted pests and critters. So maintaining our bin. You're going to want to aerate the material by turning the pile once a week, especially during warm weather. So you can use a pitchfork or a compost aerator. I have a photo on my slide of an aerator. So essentially it's just a little probe. There's two little hooks that are pushed down when you're putting the probe into the compost. When you pull it up, they're released and they help to turn. So turning the compost accelerates decomposition and discourages pests and odors. You're going to want to check the moisture levels each week. So your compost pile shouldn't be dry. The material should be moist to the touch and only produce a trickle of moisture when it's squeezed. So add water when necessary if it is feeling too dry. If the pile isn't wet enough, many of the microorganisms involved in decomposition won't be able to function. It's also a good idea to keep your leaves in the fall so you have brown materials on hand once spring arrives, and keep them close to your bin for easy access. So obviously, with anything that we do outside in nature, there's going to be some issues that pop up. We can't always predict how nature is going to react. So we'll go over a few troubleshooting ideas. So some of the most common problems are flies, for example. If you do have flies, try covering your compost with a thick layer of soil or leaves. If only the center is damp, then mix the pile and bring outside material to the center and add water. If your compost isn't warming, add some more greens. So these are things like your fruit and vegetable scraps or green grass clippings. If you're noticing an unpleasant smell, you probably have poor air circulation and the pile is too tightly packed. So mix your pile and add dry leaves or grass. If you have an ammonia smell, it means you have too many greens, so add some browns. It can take a bit of practice to figure out the right mixture of green and brown materials. So when in doubt, it is better to add more brown materials than green. More browns will slow down decomposition, but can alleviate most of these most common issues. So how do you know when your compost is finished? Another question I get very often. So it can take anywhere from a few months to a year to complete. It really depends on how you're balancing your materials. So the greens versus browns, how much water is in the compost, as well as the air circulation. So many factors are combined that do increase decomposition. If you can identify food scraps, your compost isn't ready. So some materials like woody browns take longer to decompose. One option is to sift your compost and return materials to the pile that still need more time to break down. In terms of using your finished compost, it can be added to flower and vegetable gardens, as well as potted plants. It's difficult to add too much compost to your soil. For use outside, add 1 to 3 inches of compost over your garden area in the fall, and then dig it into the top 4 to 8 inches of the soil. For indoor plants, you can use up to 25% compost in your potting mix, or sprinkle it on the top of existing plants. So here's something that is very appropriate for Winnipeg and Manitoba. I get this question frequently as well. Can I compost in winter? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So depending on the size of your pile, it will likely freeze and decomposition will stop, but you can continue to add materials to your bin. In fact, the freeze-thaw cycles throughout the late winter and early spring will actually help to break down the materials you're adding, and will break down even faster once the warmer temperatures arrive. So in some ways, winter composting is easier than composting in the summer. There's no need to cover food scraps with leaves because they'll freeze and won't have an odor that will attract insects. And there's no need to turn your compost because it'll be frozen solid. Getting to your compost can be a bit more difficult in the winter. Ideally, you want to place it close to your house so you don't have to travel too far. Another option is to store your food scraps in a larger pail or container, so you're taking fewer trips to your bin. You can also pick a milder day to head out to your compost bin. Depending on the size of your bin system, it might fill up over the winter. So make sure to harvest any finished compost in the fall. But if your bin does fill up, you can store additional material in a separate container, like a pail or garbage can, and dump the material in your bin once the spring arrives. So there are options if you don't have an outdoor space for backyard composting. So vermicomposting is a great option for those without a backyard. Vermicomposting is composting with worms, but they aren't the regular earthworms that live in our soil. Vermicomposting requires something called a red wriggler worm. So they are not found here in Manitoba. They are a tropical species, and they are much more efficient at eating organic material. They can reproduce quickly, and they are happy to live in a small container. So to start a worm bin, you'll need a few basic materials. So you're going to need a bin. You'll need an opaque plastic container, such as a Rubbermaid with a lid. Worms don't like light. The container should be wider than it is tall. Drill holes in the lid for ventilation and in the bottom of the container for drainage. It's not a bad idea to place a shallow pan under the bin to catch any moisture. There are a few places in Winnipeg that sell red wriggler worms. You'll want at least 5 pounds, or pardon me, half a pound, not 5 pounds, half a pound when you're starting out, and cover them with bedding. Bedding will provide your worms with a medium in which to live and will also help to regulate moisture levels. Ideally, bedding should be made of shredded newspaper. So you're going to want to avoid glossy paper, be about 6 to 8 inches deep, and be loosely packed. Dampen your bedding so that it's moist but not wet to the touch. Avoid putting your bin in a sunny area or where the temperature is below 10 degrees Celsius. Keeping your bin inside year-round is probably the best way to ensure that the bin stays within the proper temperature range. Store your bin in an area that is easily accessible, like under the kitchen sink, in a closet, or in the basement. Lastly, for your vermicompost bin, you will need organics. So how do you feed your worms? So vermicomposting is a pretty simple process. You're going to want to feed your worms once to twice a week by burying food under the bedding. Red wrigglers are vegetarians, so feed fruit and vegetable scraps, but try to limit anything really acidic like tomatoes, oranges, lemons, and coffee grounds. Don't add meat, dairy, or oily foods. If your worms are having trouble processing all of the food, then wait a few days before the next feeding. Change where you place the food. This will help to keep fresh food scraps and decomposing material separate and help to make composting, or pardon me, to make compost harvesting easier. Keep extra food in a container in the freezer to keep it from going moldy in between feedings. Freezing will also help to speed up decomposition, but you are going to want to thaw the food before you add it to your bin. Believe it or not, red wriggler worms can eat about half of their own body weight in food per day. So they're really efficient at processing organic material. So harvesting your vermicompost. The finished compost called castings is actually worm poo. So you'll know it's ready once it looks like soil and all of the pieces of food have broken down. You'll want to leave as many worms and worm eggs in the bin as you can. Eggs are lemon shaped, white to brown in color, and just larger than the head of a pin. It's very likely that you will miss setting aside all of the worms and eggs. That's okay. Worms are excellent reproducers. There are two ways to harvest your finished compost. The first one is the light method. So remove the lid from your bin and wait until the light pushes the worms down. After a few minutes, scrape away a layer of the finished compost. Repeat this process until all of the compost is harvested. The second method is to move all of the finished material over to one side of the bin. Within a couple of weeks, the worms will have moved to the side with the new material, making the finished compost easier to harvest. Worm castings can be added to your soil, but they have even more nutrients than regular compost, so you're going to want to add in moderation. So obviously, just like with composting, you might run into some issues with your vermicompost bin. So I'm going to go over a few of the most common problems. If your vermicompost bin is too dry, add food with high water content, such as melon, or you can even add a small amount of water. If your vermicompost is too wet, stop feeding for a few days, as food creates additional water. Also try stirring the compost, adding dry bedding, or leave the lid ajar for a short period of time. Do make sure you are monitoring your bin if you have the lid off, because it can dry out quite quickly. If your bin is emitting an odor, it means the worms aren't able to process the food fast enough and it's starting to decompose. So stop feeding and restart when they've been able to process the existing food. If your bin is attracting flies, it might be because some of the food is exposed. So place new food material under the bedding and worm castings and stop feeding for a few days if the problem continues. So those are all of the composting slides that I have for you today. I do have a little bit more information with additional resources here for you guys. So Fort White Alive sells Earth Machine compost bins. They're available at our nature shop, and we are currently running a promotion. So if you purchase a compost bin as well as a rain barrel at the same time, you will receive 15% off of your purchase. It is an Earth Day promotion, and the sale ends today at 5 o'clock when we close. So if you're interested in getting in on it, you're gonna have to hurry down. You have about 2.5 hours to make your purchase. Otherwise, the compost bins are available for $66 plus tax. The Green Action Center is a great resource for both composting and vermicompost information. Compost Winnipeg is the commercial composting company that I mentioned that is servicing various neighborhoods in Winnipeg. If you are interested in commercial compost pickup, I strongly recommend getting in touch with them. And lastly, I have a provider called Nature's Perfect Plant Food. They are one of the places in Winnipeg that is selling red wriggler worms. There are a couple other places to purchase them. I've even heard of people going on Kijiji. So there's a couple options for worms, but they aren't quite as available citywide as, for example, a compost bin. So those are all the slides that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Perfect. We do have some questions coming in here. So you had mentioned grass clippings as one of the green items that we could put in. Can we add things like spruce pine cones and needles and small branches and leaves to our compost?
Yeah, I would say with the needles, they are going to be a bit acidic. I would add those in moderation. Woody materials are going to take longer to break down. So things like the cones and the twigs, I would chop them up as small as you can, but they're not going to break down as fast as food waste. So what you might have to do is sift your compost once the food material has broken down, and you can re-add those woody materials back to your compost again if they haven't broken down.
Perfect. What kind of compost is better, a tumbling type or a tank type with air vents?
That's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on how much time you want to spend maintaining your bin. So with the rotating drum, they have a handle, and so you can literally just turn the handle and it rotates your compost. With I guess a more traditional bin style that's not rotating, you are going to have to get in there with either a compost aerator or a pitchfork. Even a shovel will work if you don't have it, but you're going to have to get in there and dig around more than you would if you had a rotating drum. Also depends if you are maybe a little bit limited in terms of mobility. With a traditional bin that sits on the ground, you're maybe going to be leaning over a bit more. With the drum, it's a little bit higher up, and maybe makes it a little bit more accessible.
Cool. Can you use ripped up newspaper in your traditional compost bin, or would the ink be considered harmful?
No, you can use ripped up newspaper. Yeah, the ink is not going to be harmful to your finished compost whatsoever. And that's a great way actually to compost, it's a great option for brown materials, I should say. Yeah.
So when you're mixing your compost and you said turn it once a week, does that mean mixing it all together thoroughly? Do you just need to turn part of it? Do you need to pull the insides out and the outsides back in?
Yeah, I would actually mix it as much as you possibly can. So I've had difficulty doing that. It's a little bit easier said than done, especially because the top of your compost bin is generally more narrow than the bottom. But if you can get in there as deep as you possibly can, the microorganisms that are going to be really active at the bottom when you started your compost, if you can get those throughout the entire material in your bin, you're going to be increasing the speed of decomposition. So mixing it just as much as you possibly can, getting down as far as you can, and then always remembering to put a top layer of browns, just so you're not attracting any unwanted critters.
Great. What is the fastest vegetable to compost, and will that get the compost going quicker?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the exact answer, but I would say something that is really high in water content. So maybe something like a tomato, I would say. I think I did mention in the presentation, if you do want to kind of get a brand new compost bin started a little bit more quickly, it's not a bad idea to add some finished compost in the bottom of your bin. That's just going to add the right microorganisms. It's not necessary, but if you are wanting to have finished product sooner, then that's not a bad tip.
Great. And could you use ash from fire pits into a compost?
That's a great question. It is a natural material. I don't know if I know for sure the answer on that one.
Well, maybe we can find it. I've got the person who asked that question, so maybe we can find the answer and get back to her.
Yeah.
Perfect. So here's somebody who said they found their red wigglers on Kijiji for $15, and it was their first winter vermicomposting, and it was really impressive how much they could consume, and it doesn't smell or anything. So for anybody who is interested in trying that out, there's a testimony from somebody in our audience tonight. I've also got a couple more questions here, Mina. So someone in our audience makes beer and ended up with approximately 15 pounds of moist grains, barley and wheat, per batch that they try to compost. They're using an earth machine composter, but this spring it was quite warm, it was steaming, and it was really smelly. Do more browns need to be added to this, or is there another solution?
I guess my question would be, it sounds like the material is going in wet.
Yeah, it does sound like it's going in moist. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like there might be too many greens in that case. I'm not sure how much space you have available, but if it's possible to even dry some of that material out first, even if you just put it on a tarp in your backyard on a nice hot sunny day, then that would help to reduce the moisture content a bit. So yeah, what I'm guessing is that probably you have a bit more green material there and will need additional brown material.
Perfect. So you had recommended putting some compost in your bin. Would you recommend a compost accelerator, such as a spray or powder that is commercially available?
I wouldn't not recommend a commercial product, but it's not necessary. So we're trying to encourage you to do things as naturally as possible and really as affordably as possible. So even just talking to a friend that has a compost bin and getting some of their finished compost, all the natural microbes are already going to be there, and you don't have to go to the store and spend money.
Perfect. What does Fort White offer compost collection site for the public, or are there any other organizations that do?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, we don't offer general drop-off for the public for organics. And I'm not aware of a commercial facility that accepts drop-offs. What I would recommend though is maybe looking on the City of Winnipeg's website. I know there are several community gardens spread throughout the city, and I know many of them do have compost bins. So I would suggest getting in touch with some of the local community gardens and see if they are accepting residential compost.
That's a great suggestion. There's lots in every community, and I'm sure they would be happy to take some of the compost or the materials for composting to put back into their ground. So someone here has had a little bit of issue with their composter. They've been adding organics since last summer, but doesn't think there's been enough browns added. Do you suggest just adding browns and trying to mix them in, or should they harvest what's in there and then try to relayer the compost that's not broken down?
Yeah, if there's finished compost, absolutely pull that out. Yeah, if it's done, you want to save space for any new organics that are coming in. So yeah, I would pull whatever harvest or finished compost you can out of the bin. If there are some materials that aren't decomposed, like for example, those woody materials often take longer, things like corn cobs, pull those out as well. So sift your compost a little bit. You can put those items that still need to break down back into the bin, and then make sure you're adding enough of the brown materials.
Do you have a suggestion on where we can collect or obtain more brown materials? Can you let fruit and veggies dry before adding, and does that work rather than adding more brown?
You know what? I would even suggest just going to a neighborhood park. So there's lots of little parks around my neighborhood, and generally, I don't think the city does necessarily a ton of maintenance in those areas. As I'm saying this, I'm second guessing myself, but I don't know that you could get in trouble if you just went to a city park and rake some of the leaves and put them in a bag at the end of the fall.
Well, and I'm sure any of your neighbors that have leaves wouldn't care if you took some of their leaves and saved them some of the work either.
That too. Yeah. That's probably even closer. So talk to your neighbors, or just going to a city park. And there's quite a few of them around, so you might not have to go that far either. But yeah, I'm sure your neighbors wouldn't complain if you offered to rake their leaves.
No. Can you add the worms into your outdoor compost rather than just vermicomposting to speed things up?
It sounds like we're talking specifically
the
about
red regulars. Yeah.
Worms. Yeah. So they are a tropical species. They're actually native to South America, and they do need relatively warm temperatures to thrive. So in theory, you could put them in your compost bin in the spring and they would survive the summer, but they wouldn't survive the winter. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that as a long-term solution, because you would have to continually be purchasing red wrigglers every spring because they wouldn't make the winter. So yeah, I guess possible, but it might be like a fruitless labor.
Right. Can we add straw from like a barley bale as brown material? Does straw help a compost bin thrive?
Yep, that's certainly a great example of a brown material. Yep, definitely.
Perfect. And we've got one more question here on composting. Can you use the litter from a rabbit litter box, which is a mix of shredded paper, hay, and it will have some rabbit excrement, pee and poop in that? Would that be okay to put into a composter?
I would suggest leaving it out personally. Yeah. So I think I did mention you want to bin that is about like allows for 3 feet, 3 feet by 3 feet of compostable area in order to sterilize whatever pathogens are in your compost. But I wouldn't recommend putting any kind of animal waste in a home compost bin. Yeah, I think potentially more commercial sites can handle some of that waste, or even there's actual biovators. So there's composting machines that can certainly handle pet waste. But in terms of a backyard compost, I would leave out any pet waste.
Great. And just our last question that just came in here is, when placing your bin, does it need to be on cement or quartered down, or does it need to be on bare ground when you're placing your bin in your yard?
Yeah, so ideally you want to have it on bare ground. So the insects, the invertebrates, the bacteria, the fungi that live in the soil will actually come up into the bottom of your bin. So definitely you want to have it exposed to the bare soil as opposed to on some kind of concrete or even gravel.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mina, for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge on composting. I was also going to do a little plug here for the gift shop. There are composters available until the end of the day here on sale if you purchase a rain barrel, but we will have composters set up throughout we'll have them available throughout the year as well. Thank you for everybody for joining us to celebrate Earth Week at home. Please take a moment and check out our other presentations. There's a couple more going on today, and if you give us a call, we can still get you into the creature feature tonight if you're interested. We hope you take the opportunity to get outside and enjoy your neighborhood nature as we celebrate our beautiful planet. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.